A thrill and a delight it is to say these words to you right now. Kansas City, welcome to the Eras Tour.
Good afternoon, everyone. I had a plan to play that whole video just to get us in our seats, but that didn't come through apparently. But I want to welcome you here this afternoon, and I apologize that Taylor Swift couldn't be here to welcome you to the exam tour. That's what we're calling this one, not Eras. But hopefully we can be just as entertaining as Taylor, I'm sure. I think first we'll just kick off the introductions. You know, last year I was able to draw a lot of parallels between myself and Taylor Swift, but this year, because I've been at the NEIC for an extra year, no longer 22 years, I'm now at 23 years, and there's no tie that I could find, unfortunately, but looking at the 23 and the significance, apparently some famous basketball player in Chicago a while back used to have that number. Michael Jordan, one of the greatest of all time. So I'm just going to assume that my 23rd year at the NEIC will be one of the greatest of all times as well. With me today, I have Bill O'Connell, Elise Kleba, and Scott Reeves. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves at all?
I'm Bill.
And
If you weren't all so far away, I see previous folks that I've visited and enriched their lives as part of our process.
I might steal your mic. I'm Elise Kleba. I'm a senior examination coordinator here at the NAAC. I've been here about 4 years now.
Scott Reeves. I've been with the Missouri Department of Insurance for 10 years, the last 4 years as an examiner in charge. Prior to that, I worked for a PNC company for 10 years in different frontline roles. And if you want to make your on-site visits with companies more interesting, go find the claims department and ask the claims people to tell you some good stories. They always have the best stories. That's a tip.
all right, Lise.
Perfect. Okay, well, we'll hop in just starting with some learning objectives, what we want you guys to get out of this session today. First and foremost, really being able to identify some of the sound practices that we have. Those usually come out of our peer review program that we hold. Not only identify them, also look at evaluating them. Are there things that you could take back, you could implement in your future work? Things you're not doing that you could be doing and implementing those. And then obviously we do have some accreditation up here too, and being able to really differentiate what the accreditation standard is and what the sound practices are, what kind of comes out of peer review. So that's overarchingly the goal for today, and to provide so many Taylor Swift photos. I think you'll feel like you were at the Eras Tour.
All right, thank you. So first up, we talk about communication with analysts. And this is probably one that's gotten a lot of focus over many years and continues to get a lot of focus just because of the importance and the value that it can provide to you as examiners. For accreditation purposes only, our guideline, we have a whole set that's just on communication, specifically for, not only just getting information from other areas, but we also narrow it down to focus on the analyst as well. There's two parts, the way our guidelines are laid out. We have a results-oriented and a process-oriented guideline. Now, the process-oriented, those are check the boxes, not really looking at necessarily the quality, but we're just making sure that, yes, you do hold an actual meeting with the analyst prior to the exam, so whether that's in person or by a conference call or video call, the key there is that your voices have to touch, I think is what we like to say. And then we also make sure that you're utilizing the information that they're giving to you, that the analysts are bringing to the table, and then whether or not you're then sending them the information on the back end of that as well. So we do have standards that the teams definitely look for. For the results-oriented, where it's more qualitative in nature, qualitative in nature, we're looking more at the collaboration itself. So not just do you have that meeting and do you give them information at the end, but how well you're interacting with the analyst. So that's kind of the big key part that we, when I say we, I mean accreditation team members like to see, is that you're engaging with them, you're really trying to understand the company, the analyst, you're listening to the risks that they say they have in through their analysis process, and then bringing that into the exam as relevant. And then as the exam keeps continuing to go, you kind of update them as significant issues arise, just making sure that it's more of a collaborative process. So I'd like to ask Bill, since he is the team member, he also wears an examiner's hat, but I told him he had to wear his accreditation member hat today. So typically, what are we seeing? I mean, I know we've had waves where it's been good or bad, but I'd like to see, provide some
It's been
thoughts.
improving a lot, but as I look at this picture, Taylor Swift is the analyst, and she's surrounded by examiners. And they are like, oh my God, what else is there? That's really the key. I mean, the analyst is dealing with the company on daily basis, the examiners, every 3 to 5 years? But so when they come in for that meeting with the analyst, the NEIC took the time to develop Exhibit D, which has specific things that they want the examiner to get out and receive from the analyst. So if you can kind of structure it after that, years past, examiners would come in and kind of tell the analyst, well, here's what we're going to do, and they really kind of ran that initial meeting. It's really gotten much better now that the analyst it's our meeting, you're here, listen to us, and this is what we want you to go out and look for. And we see a lot of good documentation of meetings like that, but the effectiveness of the meeting is really what's more important than how you document a planning meeting. It's not form over substance. You came, the analyst in the department kind of gave you that information, and then you take it and go off and do what we do in exams. That's kind of the purpose of Exhibit CC. We can get those moderate and significant risks from the IPS. It's the first thing that's out there. You got to have that planning meeting, and the analyst says, hey, this is what I think. Go forth and see what you can do about it, because then at the end of the exam, the examiners are going to be kind of expected to document, okay, you asked us to go out and look for this. This is what we did. This is what we found, and we agree or we disagree with you. That comes in the SRM. But really, over the years, it's gotten a whole lot better. It's gotten a whole lot more collaborative. There's still, every once in a while you see little snippets here and there where it's not as effective. But in a good practice that I like to do is, we still prepare a memo. I mean, I think every meeting should have an agenda and some sort of memo. And if the examiners keep it and someone's taking notes, send that back to the analyst so they can see what we talked about and agree or disagree. Great documentation. We both have files. Put it in the file.
Yes, thank you. So definitely I echo what Bill said, having to sit on a lot of the discussions that the teams have. We're seeing a lot of really good communication and collaboration, and that's really kind of throughout the exam. I think the one where we sometimes don't necessarily see, but our guidelines sort of point to it, is in the interim, so while the exam is happening, the communication. And a lot of times we see that the examiners are sharing that information, like the monthly meetings or bi-monthly or however frequently you're holding those meetings and status updates. You'll send those to the analyst. But I think on the other end we're not always sure what happens once those get to the analyst, which is probably another presentation for tomorrow maybe. So I will move forward, and Elise can discuss the actual best practices and what the handbook actually says, because there is some difference too.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully you guys can hear me. We're kind of sharing mics up here. So as Bill was mentioning, utilizing that Exhibit D, especially in the planning meeting, looking for specific topics, make sure you kind of touch on a certain number of things. Notably, this year in the handbook, we actually had another agenda topic added to the bottom of that exhibit, where it's just an item to talk overall how the analyst will be involved in the exam. So just kind of getting on the same page right up front. What are your expectations? What are theirs? Making sure that those are aligned. That way there's not really any surprises and that communication is ongoing. So not only utilizing that, I know Bill said also utilizing Exhibit CC, making sure that those risks that you discuss with the analyst are on that Exhibit CC to make sure that they're tracked all the way through the exam, they are addressed. But we don't really want to stop there. We want to make sure that they are transferred through, carried through the entire exam. So they really should be utilized for risk identification, looking at kind of the scoping of the exam. And I think Bill also touched on, you're taking all my points, but I think he's also touched on the moderate and the significant risks as well. So anything that has moderate or significant, those are things to consider keeping on Exhibit CC as well. So as far as during the exam, really back and forth communication throughout the exam, really depending on what's going on, if there's anything new, if there's any filings, anything that's coming up, popping up, meetings as needed with the analyst and the examiner. They can be involved in status reports, receiving updates again on that, like the latest analysis work. And so that kind of goes back to that last agenda item on Exhibit D of just how that is going to look in the exam and talking about that up front. Now, moving into more of like the wrap-up phase, the SRM and the exit meeting, making sure that any of those significant risks that are identified are explained clearly on the SRM, and any of the suggested monitoring that may come out of that is also clear. I know that we say try to give a specific timeline if at all possible. I know sometimes it's maybe not possible, but if there are specific timelines for the analyst to follow, give them that as well. And then, of course, at the end of the exam, you have that exit meeting with the analyst, kind of that handoff of information that you're just wanting to make sure everybody's kind of on the same page. You're making sure the risks make sense, any suggested follow-ups, if there's any questions, that sort of a thing. So Scott, then I'll ask you how your department handles the analyst communication.
We really focus on those hard points that you guys have mentioned already, but we keep communication going really from when we start planning an exam. When we send out the exam notices, we make sure that the analysts are aware of the exams we have going on so that they can plan out their work that they have to do to time it up with our exams that are going. We do rely on the analysts to complete Exhibit D and use that as a starting point. And like Bill mentioned, in the past, that was kind of a breakup point where we wouldn't come back till the SRM at the end of the exam. And we really keep the communication going throughout the exam. So when we finalize our EPMs, we send those to the analysts. If we have any negative Phase 1 assessments, we'll notify the analysts immediately. Once we've completed an IT summary memo, completed our final EPMs, we'll make sure that those are shared as well. And then, from there, at the end of Phase 2 to the end of the exam is a long period of time, so we make sure we keep that communication going throughout there. And we've had that be very, very beneficial for us this past year. A couple examples of that. One, we have an exam going on where through our exam work, we noticed that we had some questions about the company on where they were reporting some stuff on different annual statement items. We asked the company, they came back and acknowledged it and told us that they were reporting them on the wrong lines. So we let the analysts know because that exam's not going to be over for 6 months, but they're going to be filing quarterly statements with changes in that meantime. So they want to make sure that they know. And then on the flip side of that, we had a company that self-reported to us some issues that was going to affect different companies in a large holding group. And the analyst told the exam team about it. We took that back to our group exam, discussed it within the group, and then presented questions to the company. And within a few weeks of that initial conversation starting from our analyst to our exam team, we had an issue open in an exam that was 35 states and 85 entities. So that became a very big deal, and had we not had that initial conversation, that is an opportunity that we would have missed during that exam if we talked about it at the SRM or at that exit time. So really keeping that going is really important.
And one thing, well, it's hard for me to have one thing, but, I can't stress the importance of the SRM. I mean, to me, it's one of the most significant documents that come out of the exam. But in order to have a good SRM, it helps if we have a good IPS on the front. But that's for analysis. But the big thing is we're going to spend a long period of time, whatever it's going to be, and we need to tell the analysts they're not out there. They're creating their branded risk assessment based on trends that they're seeing and documents and ratios that they see when they're doing their assessments. But if we're doing, if we've done specific procedures during the exam that make us want to change that or even confirm it, it's like, hey, analyst, you're right. We went out, we agree with you, and we did this, and that's a good assessment. That's the main reason, and try and get that SRM. Doesn't have to be long, but it should be informative.
And one thing we do in that initial meeting with the analyst, we ask, what are some things that you would look at if you were going on site for an exam? And in the SRM, we make sure we address all of those so that we were closing that loop and handed it back to them.
Hello? Okay. That is a really great question to ask. Like, what would you want the analyst to do? I think it's important to remember, these exams, even though they have like as of dates and are set for a specific period of time, you're also wanting to make sure that a company can continue forward after you leave. So, the prospective risks and the ongoing things are important to look at. And one of the things, we're talking about communication with getting that information from the analyst. I'm sure many of you have struggled with this where the analyst might be brand new, might not have any value to add at those beginning meetings because they don't know the company yet, but perhaps you do because you've been doing the exam for that company for the last 3 times. And I think in those instances, we really just kind of need to keep those lines open still. Get as much information as you can, at least from the analysis process itself, carry it through the exam, but then that makes the SRM even more important because the whole key with that is that the analyst can then take that information that you've providing them with some, valuable information as to why a risk may be fully mitigated or why it's more of a concern, so you can kind of help them make their IPS and analysis going forward a little bit more robust, I guess you could say.
Okay, we are going to switch gears a little bit and chat about corporate governance and sound practices in this area. Ultimately, I think the biggest thing here is making sure that the conclusion that is reached on corporate governance is clear. And what I mean about that is sometimes in peer review, we will see a moderate corporate governance conclusion, and that kind of poses some questions of what is a moderate corporate governance? What does that look like? How does that impact the exam? Which I really think is the key here of the corporate governance and how that impacts the exam ultimately. So making sure that conclusion is clear regarding whether it's effective and appropriate. Now, there are times where there are significant issues or things that pop up with corporate governance, and it is assessed as ineffective. So again, we want to look at the impact of that on an exam, because I think maybe more often than not, we do see an effective corporate governance conclusion. But when you run into an ineffective conclusion, what does that look like? So you see there on the slide some potential impacts. Maybe that impacts your ability to rely on controls, especially with the management override piece. Potentially, it brings up prospective risks. Depending on how pervasive it is, there may be a change in priority rating warranted, really just depending on the nature of it. But at the end of the day, we really want to just see you assess the conclusion, but that conclusion is kind of carried through the exam. And so we're not saying, oh, if corporate governance is ineffective, but we're going to rely on all these controls, and there's a little bit of disconnect there. So if there is any significant issues, if it is assessed as ineffective, that is something to consider really touching base with the company via the management letter or the analyst as well. So just something to keep in mind on that. So Scott, I will turn this back over to you on some things you might look for and how you kind of make sure that it flows through the exam.
Sure. Really, starting point is Exhibit M. Go through and complete all the questions and make sure that we cover all the points there. It really gives us a chance to make sure we have a consistency throughout the exam, make sure nothing's missed, no points are missed, something we didn't think of. So we start there. We'll take a look at our officers and board members of our entities. If it's part of a group, are those officers and board members members of other boards in the company? Are they part of the parent in there? If there's been other corporate governance assessments done of those companies, we'll compare ours to theirs to make sure we're consistent there. Is there anything that we missed or maybe they missed, and we can talk about it in a group exam. Did the analysts have any concerns with the corporate governance? Our officers during our kickoff meeting, do we need to help facilitate getting biographical affidavits, third-party verifications, those things? So we'll try to do that. Does our entity have separate committees? If ours has separate committees, can we get those minutes and review those, not just rely on parent committees? The things that we are told during interviews, can we substantiate those things? Can we go back to minutes and verify that these things occurred? Can we get presentation material for presentations or anything like that that can substantiate what they're telling us? Is what we're being told during interviews consistent across executives? Sometimes you'll have one executive tell you one thing, and 2 hours later, a different executive tells you the complete opposite. It's happened. And one thing we do at the end of our interview notes from our interviews is keep a section where we summarize that interview, how it went, what we thought, how confident they were, and then what risks did we get from there? Did we get some emerging risks or some risks that could be useful somewhere else in the exam? And we'll include those risks there and then hyperlink them to Exhibit CC and make sure that they're carried forward to Exhibit CC, and then from there to a key activity or Exhibit V or wherever they need to go.
So this is the easy one for me. For accreditation, we really and truly don't actually have a standard that is specific to corporate governance. We do have to look for it and make sure that it's included in the exam planning memo. But that being said, it doesn't mean that we don't look at corporate governance. We, again, meaning the accreditation team, we do it kind of gets grouped into our overall risk, what is it called? The risk assessment and testing standard within that, where that's essentially just pointing to the financial condition examiner's handbook and making sure you're following those procedures. We can't really, we don't have one that is exactly specific for corporate governance, but the teams do, when reviewing the exams, they're looking at your communication and understanding of the corporate governance of the C-level interviews if you're gaining information from there. So for us, I think, Bill, I'd like to get your input, how, as a team member, you look when you're reviewing an exam, how you're looking for the corporate governance, or if you notice issues, what it is that you're looking for to make sure it's been addressed.
Well, and I think the big issue is when you assess, it's easy to get the weak, it's easy to get strong, but it's how that assessment impacts, sorry, and it's really how it impacts where you go. If you're looking at moderate or, we have weak corporate governance, but then you want to go to testing controls and I'll take 2, looks good, and you get strong controls, there's a disconnect, because if there's weak corporate governance, it's going to be kind of challenging to get to strong controls, especially if there's management override. There's still a lot of that going on out there. Doesn't mean you have to have, small staff, but when you get that certain manager, and if it's documented in the corporate governance assessment that you think there's problems, and then you go over into your testing, there ought to be a connection somewhere. And a lot of times what I don't see is that middle step that the examiners say, we had this, but because of that, they did, and we got to strong over here. We just didn't go back and change our memo. Well, go back and change the memo.
All right, moving forward to the IT review conclusions. We do have an actual accreditation standard specific to IT. It's under the use of specialists. And here we're looking again, basically just to make sure that the person performing the review is qualified. It doesn't necessarily mean they need to have the CISA designations, but it does mean that they have to have the experience to be able to properly identify IT controls based on the complexity and sophistication of a company. So I would say on those larger companies with more complex IT type systems, we're probably looking for more of those specialist qualifications, but for those smaller companies that really are kind of a meat and potato sort of thing, they don't necessarily need one. So that's one of the things I think it's good to differentiate there. And then, we're looking to make sure that those 6 phases are followed throughout, that the IT review is done before planning. Sometimes we run into that. And if it does happen to exceed past the planning timeline, then was there a preliminary assessment made? And then if that preliminary assessment held once that IT was done, that's always an important thing. I think, examiners are quick to want to go ahead and move on and continue with the exam. But if the IT assessment changed, that could potentially impact your entire exam based on that overall assessment. So I think it's important, to remember the teams are definitely looking to make sure time-wise everything's done, as well as the assessment itself. Bill, I think you might have some thoughts on as a team member.
And the big thing is, if it comes up with ineffective, somehow the IT examiner and the EIC should talk about, well, what made it ineffective, because that has a huge impact on what I'm going to be doing later on, because if you say everything's ineffective, well, can I rely on the numbers coming out of the general ledger? Oh, well, I didn't really mean that. And it's like, well, then tell me how you got to ineffective, because maybe I like effective except for, or is it ineffective except for?
Effective except for, I
There
think
you go.
Usually, but I guess it could go the other way.
And the big thing is, how is that assessment going to impact the exam going forward? If we've got some SOC 1s and 2s from service providers, well, geez, now we can start accepting claims handling, because that's outside of the company's IT system, because we've already got that. The big issue, though, is once you get that, make sure that there's documentation of that meeting with the EIC and the IT specialist. I mean, I see out there where certain groups, they'll have an IT specialist come in, they do all the IT work, sign off, and leave, and the EIC just, okay, and it's like, well, you've got to be able to review that work, and the standard is gain an understanding of what's there. So document it with a meeting, meet with them, hey, how can I test this? What did the CPAs do? And a lot of times that you can get to an IT ineffective if, well, they don't have a control to prevent, password usage if somebody leaves. Well, a lot of times the auditors will go in and test that and say, yep, they failed because they have a bad control, but we tested, and over the past 2 years, nobody with an expired password was actually tried to get into the system. So, oh, great. So it's technically an ineffective IT general control, but when we tested that, nobody actually, that control, while it's ineffective, there was nothing to detect or to control. So document that and move on. But once again, document it in your work papers.
Document it or it didn't happen, right? It's the auditor and me. I think from a sound practices perspective, again, similar to the corporate governance assessment, really here we're just looking for a clear conclusion. So, the effective, the ineffective, effective except for. And I think the effective except for piece is pretty important, because instead of just jumping to completely ineffective, are there things that you can rely on? Is it just totally, completely ineffective? Or are there some things like, no, maybe most of it or some of it is ineffective, but actually you can rely on this system or this report and utilize the controls around that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be all or nothing. I think that is a little bit of a mindset that we can get into sometimes. It's either effective or it's ineffective. So if there are certain things, certain processes, certain systems you can rely on, just making sure that that is, again, documented, as Bill was saying, like, hey, this is effective except for this one system or XYZ, instead of just jumping to effective or ineffective. So again, doesn't have to necessarily be all or nothing. And to Bill's point a little bit too, you want to kind of consider with the IT general controls, if something is ineffective, if it's not working, what is the impact on that for the exam? Does that directly impact the financial statements? Does that directly impact anything that would be decision making? Some of those controls are much more related to the financial systems and data or the examiner would be utilizing to test, or are they more like a continuity management control and they don't necessarily have a direct impact on the financial statement? So that's just something to think of, keep in mind as well here. And again, the impact on the exam. So similar to the corporate governance conclusion, we would hate to say, IT general controls are ineffective, but here we are relying on a couple controls throughout the exam or that sort of a thing. So just making sure that that's kind of followed throughout the exam, that we're keeping that conclusion in mind and following that.
A great one is disaster recovery and business continuity. Well, if they haven't had a disaster in the past 5 years, but they haven't tested it, okay, I get that. But that really isn't going to have an impact on what's sitting in the general ledger or the other systems for me. But give them the finding, make them do something about it, but let's move on.
Definitely. So Scott, then I'll let you kind of speak to what you do when you see more of an ineffective assessment, or do you push back a little bit on the IT examiner to figure out what you can rely on?
Really start with the answer.
Sorry.
Really start with asking questions to get the answers from what you two have mentioned. If it's one system that's causing the issue, where in the IT infrastructure does that fit in financial reporting and all the different pieces of the company, of what downstream from that is effective? Is there still systems that we can use and test and rely on and explain all of that, in those conversations? If it's a cybersecurity issue, but financial reporting is good. Then from there, we take that information, we go back and look at external auditors. What was their conclusion? Were they relying on those systems? And if we've determined we can't rely on those systems, but the external auditors did, can we use their work if they're using an ineffective system? If it's a situation where one person has the password for every employee of the company, well, can't use anything at that point if everybody can override. Go back to internal audit. If they have a good internal audit and they've relied on IT systems, usually during those conversations with internal and external audit, we've asked the question of how they got comfortable using IT and relying on the IT system. So hopefully we already have that information. But if we have this new finding, then that's something that we need to reconsider. And then also, how does that affect corporate governance? IT is such an important part of all the insurance companies out there now that if you don't have a good IT infrastructure, then how does that affect your corporate governance? Can you rely on that? Are they not putting their resources where they need to and making sure things are taken care of there?
Yeah, I think I know on several accreditation reviews, we've certainly come across an ineffective for IT. And I think whenever any of our team members come across that, they instantly just kind of, it's never good for us to see because it really does blow up the exam. We like, if it is ineffective and truly is ineffective, we definitely look to make sure the testing was proper. But like on all the controls, that they did what they needed to do to cover and ensure that what the data is that they're receiving is accurate and they can rely on that or use that data. And I even think we've come across an instance where they relied on a SOC 1 report, which didn't fully encompass the entire IT assessment, and said, well, they're good because of that. And so it really that impacted the exam overall as well, because they relied on something that they really couldn't fully entirely rely on. So there's various ways, though. I know the review teams really do try to give the examiner the best reasonable regulator approach sort of thing. So even if there was an ineffective control, they do look at the CPA work papers and be like, okay, well, did they test it? And they have those conversations with you as examiners. I mean, we all understand exams have to be done in a certain time, and so we're really just trying to understand your process, how you assessed it, how you brought it forward through the exam, and how you thought about things, how you approached it. So, if those are the things that if it's not like clearly documented in the file, that the conversations we'll have during those interviews. So it's always something that we're looking for, and definitely like to see effective if it truly is effective, or effective except for any of those situations. But when it's clearly ineffective, it always is a little nerve-wracking at first.
Well, and just one thing to follow up, the main issue is you're getting information from your specialist. You've hired that specialist, same thing as an actuary. What are you doing with the information you're getting from the specialist? If you're just, okay, well, I'm going to do this anyway. Well, there's a disconnect there. And on IT, well, even with actuarial, that can be a huge disconnect. And then you're going on about your exam with improper information. And you could come up with the wrong result.
All right. So moving on to emerging risks. And once again, accreditation really doesn't have anything that addresses emerging risks. That doesn't mean that the teams won't look for it, or if it's noted elsewhere in, say, an analysis file, or if they're doing a news search and something comes up, or in a statement, annual statement in the notes, there's something mentioned. So they do come up from time to time, and they can kind of be encompassed under, again, our risk assessment and testing standard, because again, that points back to the examiner's handbook, kind of encompassing how you perform an exam overall. But I know that this is something that I think the peer reviews have been finding. I don't know, I mean, Bill, just first for you, we don't really encounter this very often, but I know we have maybe a handful of times. Do you have any?
And the big thing is, what are they doing with it? I keep coming back to that, but that's really, because you're getting the information from the analyst, how is that impacting your exam? If you're like, well, I'm just looking at this going back, you're really not anymore. It's that, and then all that up there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I will say we have seen this kind of become a little bit more of a pattern in the last couple of peer review sessions that we've had. So we do have some sound practice guidance that we developed kind of in response to what we were seeing. And I think in general, it's really easy to get caught up in that as of date, that balance sheet date, and be like, actually, nope, we're good. This, as of December 31st, 2024, nothing was wrong, so we'll just call it good. Meanwhile, you're still in the exam and something pops up that, as Bill said, you don't really want just sitting. So, the average exam cycle is 5 years, give or take a little bit. And so the last thing you want is something to pop up while you're finishing up the exam and for you to just kind of ignore it because, well, it was after the as of date. And so who knows what that's going to look like in 5 years when you get back. So the sound practices really kind of add that guidance of, okay, you're doing an exam, this risk that has popped up is after the as of date, but you're still in the exam. So what can you do or what's expected? And I think the main thing is, as Bill had touched on, making sure you look at it or do something with it. Again, not just ignoring it. And depending on where you're at in the exam, also probably depends on what you can do, with it, right? So if you're in field work still, this is something that you could add to a risk matrix, or you could add to Exhibit V, for instance, or say you're a little bit further along, you're trying to wrap up the exam, and this thing pops up. So just kind of debating, thinking through, is this worth, does this require any further investigation, whether that be, you know, a limited scope exam in the future, or do we need to suggest some specific monitoring procedures for that analyst? Those are some options too, depending on where this is popping up. Again, it really depends on the nature of the risk, what you're looking at, how significant it is. But I think overarchingly, the guidance really is just trying to get at, we hope that it would not just be sitting until that next exam cycle, especially if you're still on site or continuing to work on the exam. So Scott, I don't know if you've seen any of these recently and how you kind of handle any of the emerging risks.
Sure. Emerging risks really can come from anywhere, and it's a good chance to put on your auditor hat and really do some investigative work to try to figure out what's going on with some of these, because just by their nature of them being kind of down the road for these companies, it's a chance to learn about something new and do some work on something that maybe we haven't talked about or had in another exam before. So it's a good opportunity to kind of dig in. And like I said, those can come from anywhere. They can come from your corporate interviews. If they do, you know, Exhibit CC is a good opportunity to put there to make sure that you're tracking them through to Exhibit V and taking care of them. They can come from the NORSA review. They can come from your IT review. We include emerging risks and prospective risks on our Exhibit V from the IT review in the same location. It can come from NAIC alerts, industry news, like principal-based bonds that are coming up for changes. So that's one that we've added to a company here recently, and we added it after we were done with phase 2 and had our planning memos and everything done, but it popped up after that. So we still have the exam going on, so we still have a chance to look at it. So we add it to Exhibit V and indicate that we added this later and why we did that, so it shows a record of why we did it at that time. But following up on those and making sure that you do what you can. If it's something that's really far off in the future, maybe it's something we don't have a whole lot of information on, but we can do a little bit of research. We can ask the company what their research they've done, and maybe they can educate us on that risk a little bit. And then if it's something that we're not going to get fully comfortable with during the exam, we add it to the SRM and hand it back to the analyst, and maybe a year or 2 years, maybe revisit this, or next exam cycle, we'll revisit it again.
And I will say, you know, accreditation, although we don't really have a specific standard, you know, one of the things that we do is we pick an exam and then we pair that with the analysis. So we're able to see both sides of the files. And usually when the exam we've selected, we select the 5-year worth of analysis. So we cover that analysis period of 5 years. So we can see the whole start of the exam through the analysis process. We can see the end of the exam through the analysis process. And we're also seeing what happened with the company. And so a lot of times too, when the teams are looking at the analysis files, they may see something like, oh wow, this came up, and they may even bring it up in an exam interview just to say, were you aware of it? Was there any indications? It's never a gotcha. They're just really trying to understand the entire process itself. But it's part of the reason why accreditation is laid out the way that it is so that we can kind of look at both sides of the coin. So it's always, this is interesting to me because it is new, and it's just something that the teams, again, we haven't seen a lot of, but it has popped up a couple times. And I think, you know, Elise, as she alluded to in the peer review sessions, it's definitely come up. So something just to be aware of. And there's no Taylor on this slide, so I apologize.
Yeah, so you've heard us talk quite a bit today about sound practices, and hopefully you are familiar with our sound practice document. If not, I took up the Taylor Swift image to show you where you can find the sound practices, and it is under the Financial Examiner's Handbook Technical Group. You can go to that web page. You have to kind of go over to the right on the upper hand side under the Documents tab. There'll be a little link there for financial examination tools and resources, and the sound practices document will be there. And we are continuously updating these, especially as a result of peer review sessions. If there's things that we're seeing, if there's things that we're noticing, this is updated pretty regularly. Recently, it was updated to kind of be more of a apply and avoid format, I guess you could say, hopefully for more of an ease of use. Here are things, it kind of goes through the 7 phases, different areas of an exam. Here are things to apply, and here are things maybe to avoid doing. So if you're noticing any of those, to avoid or to apply, hopefully, like I said, these are just a handful of ones that we picked out, but there's quite a bit there. We just integrated our contractor sound practices. We used to have a totally separate document, sound practices for the utilization of contractors. We just integrated that in with our larger document. So it should be kind of a catch-all. Everything's there for you to reference pretty easily, I hope. And as we continue with peer review sessions, it will probably continue to be updated pretty quickly after that. So we just had a peer review session, a couple weeks ago now, right before Labor Day. And we did make some small tweaks just based upon the discussions that we were having in peer review. Small things like perhaps interview questions, maybe giving the interviewee a list of topics that will be discussed just so they have an idea of what's coming. But that would be on the apply side. On the avoid side, maybe avoid giving them the specific interview questions that you're going to ask. Otherwise, you're going to get a pretty robotic, well thought out response, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but you do want to kind of, like Scott mentioned, assess their confidence level and kind of assess competencies as well. So we did just make that little bit of a change there. It may not be posted just yet as we were going to run it through the risk-focused surveillance working group chairs, but it should be posted, that like updated version here pretty soon. Another one we had that's kind of related, since we talked about corporate governance, we do talk a lot about corporate governance, and like I said, the overall assessment, whether it's moderate or effective, ineffective, that sort of thing. And what we're seeing is some departments are utilizing their own exhibitum, so to speak. They're kind of reinventing the wheel there as far as the tool goes on corporate governance, and there are certain departments that are using specific ratings. They have their own tool that kind of gives a numeric value and ranks certain things. And so another addition to our sound practices document is that if that is the case, if you guys are using that, there's nothing wrong with that, but just providing the documentation of what does this number mean if you are kind of going your own route with that. So again, mostly coming out of our peer review sessions. We do have a couple peer review sessions slated tentatively for next year on exams. I believe May, we're shooting for early May, and I think August-ish. So early fall or late summer, however you want to look at it. So if you're interested in participating, I think overarchingly we hear time and time again, this is the best training. This isn't somebody sitting up here and giving you insight, which is very valuable, but when you're hands-on in the file, kind of combing through what's there, having those group discussions on certain things like corporate governance assessment and things like that, it's really useful. So if you have not been, I encourage you. That information will be passed along as those dates get sooner, but just an FYI, there will be 2 sessions upcoming next year for peer review, and hopefully maybe some more sound practices will come out of that. The more we see, the more we get to know.
In the final minute, the sound practices documents, I love the apply avoid, because it's easy when I'm out looking in reviewing SRMs, IPSs, this, that, and the other, and it's like, this is an avoid, you know. Yeah. It's right here in black and white and red, because you've got the red, and, you know, you can enhance that, and, you know, we're not there to get you, but it's to build a better mousetrap.
Yeah. And I will say the team members they're all given the sound practices. So they're all very much aware of them. They may have those conversations with you in their meetings, But I do want to stress to you as well, like if you think, well, that's not a guideline, that's not anything. Yes, we know this, but they still, we've been we're trying to help promote those sound practices just so that we can continue to raise the bar on the work that we're doing overall. But when it comes down to the final decision-making by the team, they do hold them strictly just to the guidelines. So even if you may feel like they're asking something outside of the scope of our review team guidelines, again, that's really just trying to help you raise the bar to think about something different. But when it comes down to the actual end result, we're always held to just the baseline minimum from the review team guidelines. And I think really we're really close to the end. We did provide our contact information for you, but
We're at
happy to
extra
take.
time.
And I did actually, I did not throw a Taylor Swift picture in here. I felt like the guys needed a little bit of, although, fun fact, Hugh Jackman is friends with Taylor Swift. So it's adjacent to her. But if you guys have any questions, we're definitely around. Please feel free to contact us at all. So thank you very much for your time.